Well, good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, those of you who are over here in Europe. I'm delighted to be back again. I spoke with CCGI last year, I believe, on governance issues, but Kamala and the team have asked me to talk about one of our areas of expertise, which is the evaluation of global commercial centers or global financial centers. And what I hope to speak about in sort of 20 minutes and then get into the panel session is very much the position of three of our index and the way in which we evaluate global financial centers, but also smart centers and also global green finance centers. And I'll give a little bit of color into some of the things to do with Latin America and the Caribbean. So a teensy bit of background about our firm. YZen, which many of you will know, styles itself as the City of London's leading financial think tank, which may sound a bit arrogant. But we have brought out a number of things over many years and are quite proud of the group. We publish these various indices every 3 months, but in truth, they're a very small proportion of what we do. What YZen does is typically research, and that research ranges from hard physics and sciences through to economics and finance. We also run something which I know many of you come to, which is the FS Club. That's a community getting on for 50,000 people globally, and we meet about 3 times a week to discuss issues of relevance to technology, economics, and finance. And I say all of this to point out really that the 3 indices that we produce are a very small percentage, perhaps 5% of our business. But unfortunately, as with many things, you're famous in undue proportion to something that you really spend very little time on. Anyway, so what do those indices look like? Well, they began back in 2002, really, when the City of London Corporation, of which I happen to be an alderman, and I was sheriff of the City of London for 2 years until last month, the City of London was worried about its role in the world after, believe it or not, the euro in 1999. And so in 2001, it commissioned a study called Sizing Up the City. And this looked at the impact that leaving, well, not participating in the formation of the euro might have made on the competitiveness of London. This was a very brute force study, and it examined all of the competition for the City of London in 2002. That was London looking at it being compared with New York, Paris, Frankfurt, and that was it. And that certainly wasn't the world that I knew, which had places in it like Hong Kong and Singapore and Tokyo, et cetera. So the study was quite limited. And we went to the corporation and said, perhaps it'd be better if they were to compile an index really looking at the richness of financial centers. And we came up with our instrumental factor methodology, which has been copied over the last 2 decades by a number of social science organizations, where we effectively put in a lot of instrumental factors into various types of regression systems and are able to tease out and combine what people think about centers emotionally and qualitatively with a whole number of substantial facts about them as well. The index itself was begun formally in 2005 and published for the first time in 2007. And we took a long, hard look when we were publishing this because we really wanted to get it right, which is why we spent 2 years in dry runs and trials seeing what mattered. The initial index had 46 centers in it. Today we cover 116 with an additional 10 waiting associate status. The reason for the large rise in the centers, though, is real. It's policymakers seeing that changes in policy, such as regulation or opening competitive markets or freeing up the internet, can make an enormous difference in building a financial center quickly in ways, in fact, that can be difficult in other sectors, such as, for example, manufacturing. The second thing, of course, has been the burgeoning of finance globally, and financial centers do correlate extremely strongly with global trade, which over the past 50 years has grown from 27% of global GDP to 62% of global GDP. And I often talk to people, and I'm a technologist myself and very sympathetic with the presentation that preceded this, but actually the vast growth in wealth and reduction in poverty globally over the last half century is probably about twice due to trade as it is to technology. But those are the two very large drivers. This index began to be a little constrained, though. Finance is changing, it's turning into more of a utility. And I myself am a very committed environmentalist and have been since the 70s when I was doing environmental research. And we decided to focus as well on green finance. Our Global Green Finance Index was done in association with MAVA, the Swiss Foundation. This NGO is the one that's behind WWF and has quite responsibly been spending its money as rapidly as possible to make an impact on climate change, and in fact closes down next year. The idea was to spend the money rather than set up some sort of perpetual foundation because the crisis was so tight. We really appreciated working with them. And in some ways, it's been sad that the financial services community does do a lot of blather and turns up at COP26, but finds this measure rather inconvenient. And I'll come into that in a moment. And finally, for commercial reasons, we also found that the blend of science, technology, and finance, which is much wider than fintech, which is largely a narrow area, but led us to realize that we needed to examine the technological and knowledge capabilities of these centers separately. And so we also have a Smart Centers Index. Now, a quick look globally at this is the world's a big place, and we have centers all over. As I said earlier, we're covering 126 centers in some way, shape, or form. What we do in terms of our index is we take responses to a survey. We'll typically get about 12 to 14,000 people responding to a survey validly. We'll get responses quite a bit above that. They're asked what they think about rating centers around the world in terms of the future of them as a financial center. They're asked where they work. And we combine this data with approximately 135 different hard instrumental factors. And those would be things like the amount of trading capacity, the percentage of GDP taken by tax, but also some factors like the murder rate locally and things of that nature. And these two combinations allow us to both see what people think in the raw sense, but also to strip out native or home bias. It also allows us to identify whether or not they are over or underrating things. It's difficult to describe this, it's multivariate statistics, but the best way I can say is it's quite similar. What we built 20 years ago is very similar to what you see in a lot of the machine learning or AI devices today. Basically, we ask Kamla what she thinks of sort of 6 or 7 centers, and this system is able to predict what she would think about a center that she's never been to based on the sensitivities that she's provided. And it is done individual by individual. It's quite nice. I've taken it myself on many occasions. I'll put in sort of 10 centers that I'm interested in, and I'll rate them as I see them. I'll then remove one and not let the machine see it, and the machine will actually predict my response for the 10 center, typically within 10 points on a 1,000-point scale. So it's terrifically accurate and predictive. And again, another example of how these machine learning systems are in fact putting us humans sadly in our places. Now, when it comes to the respondents themselves, we have a preponderance of folks from Asia. You may find that surprising, but the move to Asia over the last 15 years has truly been gargantuan. When we began this index and I began straight lining and looking at the rise of the Asian centers, people laughed at me. They laughed at me very hard. How was it possible that Hong Kong would ever come, or Singapore ever come to rival London? And surely the Chinese centers had no hope whatsoever. In fact, as you'll see in a minute, the index is quite strongly Asian, and the only 2 strong holdouts in the West have been London and New York. We have a fairly good spread of respondents by sector, and we do analyze that in some length. And as I say, this is approximately 12,500 respondents in the last index. A quick look, just to not reveal too much or wait too long, you can see here the ranks of the top 20. I've put into the chat room links to the various indices, so you can go and look up the details yourself of any of the 3 of them. We publish quite copiously online. We do charge for detailed studies and reports, which we typically do for financial centers that want to analyze how they could improve or do better. But we do publish quite a bit openly anyway, and we have databases and graphs that you're welcome to use. So by all means, go to those links and have a look. Of the top 30 centers, what we see here is a fair amount of change in the last period. COVID has certainly changed the rating of centers, and we're having some difficulty ourselves working out what is a financial center. I'm here at the moment chatting to you from just out on the edge of the City of London, which is largely dark, and we're certainly seeing our footfall is down even still at about 50%. So the geographic center of the city, the sandwich shops, the dry cleaners, and all have been having a torrid, really bad, nearly 2 years. On the other hand, the southeast cluster in England of technology and financial services has had a boom year. It's done extremely well. So what does it mean these days to be a financial center? And this could get harder as people begin doing more working from home, but their home is now located abroad. We can perhaps cover some anecdotes about that type of movement in the Q&A. So those are the centers. You'll see here that in the top 10, we have Hong Kong, Singapore, Shanghai, Beijing, and Tokyo. So very, very strong move to Asia. It's been interesting for us that Los Angeles and Singapore have also been rising. When the index began, neither of them were seriously located, but that just shows the move towards fintech. And this constant move of fintech and Asia has meant that the traditional centers outside of London and New York, and here I would pick on Chicago, Boston, and Toronto in North America, but Frankfurt and Paris and Amsterdam and Geneva and Zurich in Europe have been pushed quite significantly down the league tables. So what were the headlines from the last one? Well, New York and London have pipped each other and swapped places once or twice. It's a tight race between them. Hong Kong and Singapore are having a lot of difficulty. Don't forget that last year was not just COVID over there, but the huge Hong Kong difficulties as well in terms of governance. San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Paris popped up quite a bit because overall the Asian centers dropped, and overall the Asian centers in China dropped even further than average. I think that a lot of people are beginning to wonder what is a financial center, as I said earlier, and therefore confused to some degree about their future as city centers. There's a lot of uncertainty around international trade, and behind the scenes, it's the trade that drives this much more than the fintech or the blockchain. The core element and charges are very much there around is finance supporting the real economy, and if finance is supporting the real economy, it's supporting trade, bills of exchange, correspondent banking, insurance, marine insurance, etc. The North American centers doing well. In the previous edition to this in 29 and 28, they were doing very poorly again due to COVID. And we're wondering if New York and London might have gone through some kind of revival where people abroad are beginning to see them as increasingly competitive because of the radical changes they've had to their working practices. Now, I mentioned that one of the things here is we're able to tease out what people would think of a center if they didn't know enough to rate it. Well, we also use this technique to identify how people would rate a center if they didn't know its name. And this allows us to do a number of types of analysis. So you'll see here that we can identify that Gift City, Gujarat is overrated massively on its with a reputational advantage of 331 on a 1,000-point scale. This is no surprise because we have a few hundred people from Gujarat coming in and rating their center at number 10. And what we're able to do here is to point out that if they didn't know it was Gujarat, they wouldn't have rated it that well at all. And these adjustments play quite a role in allowing us to see where sentiment or local bias is overtaking materiality. As you go through this list, you'll see this is quite a similar situation with Qingdao, Kigali in Rwanda, Shenzhen even, and it's not until we get to New York, but even New York and London are slightly overrated by participants who wouldn't rate them as highly if they were doing it solely on the numbers. In terms of disadvantage, which is equally there, this allows you to look at centers that are currently down, perhaps in the press or in your perception, and question whether or not this is fair. So again, Gujarat versus New Delhi, an interesting, if both of those were corrected and the algorithms are strictly right, there'd be an enormous shift in what we saw as the up and coming areas in India. Similar situation with Hamburg, of all places. Hamburg, for those of you who've never been there, and I go there quite a bit, is an enormously strong center. It's still got the last surviving insurance outcry market. And yet most people who aren't Teutonic tend not to consider it. And it would come up quite materially again if they were just to evaluate it on the numbers. So the index is able to do a number of adjustments like that. And when you do a deeper analysis with a center, you look at that quite carefully, because if reputation is down, then your strategy is largely to improve marketing. If your reputation is up, your strategy is largely to make sure that your mouth doesn't outperform your performance. So you want to make sure that you're improving things like infrastructure and education. Right. So over time, as we look at all of the regions, you can see a general bouncing around, a large rise at the bottom there in yellow of Eastern Europe. And then, as I alluded to earlier, very early in the index, that red line on the far left, sitting there between 575 and 625, represented Asia Pacific, and Asia Pacific bounced up and basically has given the West a run for the money. And in fact, if it were not for the pipping of London and New York, it would be without question the strongest region in the world. And I think that just reflects what's been going on globally over the last decade and a half. When we look specifically at just the city rankings, again, you can see this bouncing around. But truthfully, New York, London, Hong Kong, Singapore are all up there in the top five. San Francisco might get pipped by somebody that has a slightly more variable performance, but we are seeing stabilization in these regions. We can look at this a slightly different way. We can look at the rank as opposed to just the simple rating it number. So in other words, number 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, you can see at the top, London in yellow, New York in red, and just kind of swapping ground with each other. As I mentioned earlier, they swap ground twice, and a similar tie and swapping ground between Hong Kong and Singapore, with, as I indicated earlier, San Francisco a little bit more wild down there at the bottom in pink. Well, what about Latin America and the Caribbean? Well, we do put them together, I'm afraid, and I'm conscious that many of you out there might not see Mexico City or Rio de Janeiro as part of the Caribbean, but if you just look down there, you can see the strong position there of the Cayman Isles, and then not too significant a drop to the British Virgin Isles, and then Barbados, Bermuda, Buenos Aires, and the Bahamas. Personally, I've always been a little surprised at the Bahamas performance, much worse than I would have personally attributed it to. But it has been fairly consistent over ages. Those have been the numbers. You'll also notice to the right, the change in the ratings for the real Caribbean Isles has dropped quite significantly, and therefore there's been a significant drop in rank. I believe quite a bit of this is attributable again to the global financial crisis, to the COVID crisis, but also, of course, to the heavy moves on tax equalization, which have, I think, impacted this quite significantly. When we look at things on the green side, they're slightly worse in a lot of ways. The Caribbean Isles are not really seen as particularly green. Several of them don't even make the index, but the BVI, Cayman, and Bermuda are not seen as particularly strong areas for green finance. I don't think moves in terms of Bitcoin particularly help that type of perception, but the islands haven't been seen to be really training up or delivering green projects. And it's also becoming clearer and clearer that on a number of the islands that the talk about green, particularly given solar, OTEC, and many other technologies that are available, the talk doesn't really match the action. We still have tramp ships delivering, oil and gas and then burning them in conventional areas. And in numerous of the islands, of course, there's a monopoly on the central generation of electricity, which leads to that. So if you want to talk about governance in the round, and don't forget local competition and openness to markets and things like that. So it's one thing to turn up at COP and moan that the larger nations really ought to do more transfer, but it'd be quite nice as well to see a little bit more action on the ground. And in the financial community that I live in, which is full of analysts, we look at the numbers like that. We see the numbers and we make up our minds. So it's a little hard to hide it behind political headlines. We can also look at Latin America and the Caribbean as being seen as a smart area. Is this a place to go for brain power? And again, sadly, we see another cut. So we're left really with the Cayman Islands as the only Caribbean center that seemed to be worth it in terms of a location. And it doesn't do too badly in the rank or the rating in this particular case, but there was an enormous change in the rating in the last edition, and I haven't had time to figure out quite why our respondents thought that the Cayman Islands should shoot up that much. But we'll come to one thought in a moment. We also tease apart a fintech rating. There are a number of fintech ratings out there. Ours is derived off of the hard statistics of the respondents, so it's fairly firm. What you'll see here is, again, a fairly normal cut on it. I would point out in this case, a center like Shenzhen at number 7 really pops up because Shenzhen is, I think, 16th in the normal index, and it's extremely hard to pop up as you get to the top. You're fighting fierce centers that are good in a whole variety of areas, and a specialism doesn't normally help. You'll also see, of course, San Francisco bumping up a couple of points there. So it's an exciting area of fintech, but we do see it sliding as a number of centers are beginning to look at finance purely as a utility. And I wonder, frankly, if we're going to see finance holding so much sway in future with policymakers. Now, we do a whole bunch of other analysis, and I really don't want to go through it, but there are some obvious questions that people ask. Well, why don't you do this and why don't you do that? We do most of it. It's just, therefore, it means it's quite a complicated report, a long read with lots and lots of tables and indices. We do look at a whole variety of areas of competitiveness. So it breaks down into 5 general areas: the business environment, human capital, infrastructure, financial sector development, and overall reputational things, including culture and theater. So all of that is in there. Then we break that down in each case into 4 subcategories, and then those 4 subcategories break down into roughly 5 to 6 instrumental factors apiece. So it's a very, very rich system. All of those indices and all of those points and all of the reference points are referenced online. You can go back and link to and see all of them if you want to get a flavor. But we have found a number of interesting things over the years. One is the percentage of tax taken, the percentage of GDP taken by tax turns out to be a pretty good predictor of the attractiveness for corporates locating there. Secondly, we've never been able to find a correlation with weather. We did try and stick in things like days of precipitation. What constitutes good weather is somewhat relative. Personally, love the Caribbean, love visiting, would never live there, it's just too hot for me. But there are people who feel completely differently than that. I don't mind the rain and the cold, and many Caribbeans wouldn't want to live here, and that's fine. But when we did try and stick in correlations with weather, we didn't find any at all. On the other hand, people often remark, I don't see why you have murder rates in there. That's silly. That's got nothing to do with the financial center. Well, actually, bluntly, if you want my opinion, it has everything to do with the financial center. I have no intention of bringing my money to a place where I get killed. And I don't care how good it is. I don't care how wonderful the regulatory system is in the central bank. I am not bringing my cash there. And that was certainly the case, particularly in Russia, not so long ago. And there are other centers that feature there. So when the murder rate hits a particular level and starts to take off, the value of a center dries up very, very rapidly. But I'll let you dig into those if you so wish. They are really quite detailed. We then, of course, look at areas of competitiveness, and we look at industry sectors. And again, just a taste to show you that when you look at the top, you'll see New York is top in all areas of competitiveness, and London is second in 4 of them, and in the 5th one, it's 3rd. What this shows is when people look at financial centers, particularly emerging financial centers, you do need to specialize to grow, but you need a little bit of patience, because to really move up to the top, you have to start being good at everything. It's what I kind of call the Anna Karenina principle. Tolstoy says that every happy family is alike, and that every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. What he meant was when you see a happy family, everything seems to gel and work out. When you see an unhappy family, it's pretty clear. The dad's a drunk, or the mother screams at the kids, or whatever's going on. You can identify what's wrong. When it's all working well, it's hard. And this is what we've seen over the years. The bigger centers really do move across the board. So it's great to move forward on education, but you then need to move forward on regulation. You move forward on education and regulation, that's really good, but then you need to move forward on infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. You need to move forward on a lot of fronts at once if you want to penetrate into the top 20. When it comes to industry subsectors, equally, that same thing begins to apply. You see a little bit more variation here, not particularly much. For example, Singapore is extremely strong in insurance, a point that's often missed on people in London. That it's very, very high up there. In fact, London globally has been dropping in insurance for 35 years and now lies on our index roughly in 5th or 6th place, depending. Again, you'll see areas like Shenzhen, but don't forget Shenzhen has got the largest Chinese insurer up there. So there are a lot of changes moving in the industry subcenter indices, and often affected by local scandals. And so we're starting to see some of the shakeout in China at the moment. And these strengths change. These are just some spider diagrams just to help you read them. The closer things are to the center, the better. So this is one where the tighter you are, the better you're doing. And you'll see here that New York, for example, was doing poorly on human capital, has improved quite markedly. We think quite a bit of that is due to, believe it or not, working from home, able to get better people no matter where they're located, even if they don't really wish to commute into New York. In a similar vein, New York did a number of regulatory changes over the last 3 years that this comprises, and so 3.5. And the insurance sector has improved quite markedly there. A similar situation in Toronto, where it's going kind of the other way. Toronto was doing extremely well in a variety of areas, and it's been loosening now, and it really does seem to be losing its way in a whole variety of areas, almost all at once, whilst still sort of holding on to its reputation, which has been lagging, I think, the reality on the ground. Another center which I watch with great interest is Busan in South Korea. Busan is almost a sort of a model, let's develop a financial center. I went to Busan some 25 years ago, and I can assure you it was a pit. The largest buildings were 2 stories high, except for the town hall, which was 4 stories high. And yet, if you go to Busan today, it is unrecognizable. It's a particularly green city, heavily developed, an absolutely forceful government that had focused on a number of things, and worked very, very hard to make a point I'll come to in a moment about treating foreigners fairly. Women who took visas to go on financial services trips to Korea were offered special care, so they would be given a female driver at the airport. The signage moved into English. They had what I call a concierge service, but they would take you around if you were setting up a business with a translator, so that you didn't go into one place and say, I'm an asset manager, and it was translated one way. You went into another and said, I'm an asset manager, it was translated another. And suddenly some officials said, well, these 2 translations don't do, you must be up to something. They actually walked around and made sure you got all your forms right. They focused on maritime, and they focused heavily on maritime education in the maritime legal sector, wanted to get that right, moved into the Korean Stock Exchange, which is now located in Busan. And they are very, very interested in, of course, the blockchain community, and they've stayed out of some of the silly cryptocurrency hype and have focused much more on practical, real working applications than some of the kind of short-term speculation akin to gold. So they've done a tremendous piece of work. It's probably most noticeable in professional services, where that has improved quite noticeably just through the very self-evident training. And this slide I find rather interesting. I wouldn't want to live in New York, but it is it picks up as one of the most attractive places at the moment for people to work. Do note, by the way, number 2 there is Busan, who I mentioned earlier, which again I think would surprise many people, sort of even surprises me. But again, they are seeing people moving there, particularly from Hong Kong. A lot of people from Hong Kong have move to Korea and to Japan, given some of the local difficulties there. And Busan seems to be scoring quite well in that regard. But you'll see here now, one of the interesting things here is there are no Caribbean centers mentioned in that, and I find that surprising too, but maybe more people feel like me about the weather. So what do I conclude? Well, you can't be an international center without international people, and never forget that. And some of the visa issues, some of the difficulties of getting in, some of the rackets people have, all these are impediments to developing it. Successful people do want to live in successful places. And these days, success has taken on a few other hues. You need to be a lot more technical. It's not nice to just be a quiet, rich center. You need to be a technically savvy center. It's not nice, just sufficient to be a quiet, rich center. You need to be a rich, techie, and green center. And all of this is getting more and more examination. People do want to live in cosmopolitan places. They do go to clusters. And then we move on to the classic that reputation and trust matter. I might give you another example, which I frequently do have with Caribbean centers and many other small islands. Oh, that scandal. Well, forget about it. Well, when we started this index, we were receiving letters up until just a few years ago telling us that we were charlatans and we should never, ever have the Isle of Man in our index, because I was ripped off by the Isle of Man in 1975 and I lost my pension and things like that. So this bit about reputation is vital, 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it is really true, and it really sticks. And this idea that, oh, we can just make a mistake, but it's okay, we cheated a few people, big deal, or we didn't really regulate them, it'll come back again. It will, but it's going to take a generation if you're not careful. And I often get from people, stuff all the statistics, just tell me how to win. And I would say that the one way to win is to treat all comers fairly. And as this cartoon shows, everybody has a fair selection process. Just take the same exam, climb that tree. And this is one of the great strengths of London and why it's been a financial center for over 450 years, has been that starting in 1550, the attitude came, having made mistakes of our own in 1200, expelling the Jews and things like that. It made the determination that it would treat all comers fairly and that the English law would be unbiased to whoever came before it. And if you don't have that attitude, if you're always in for the home team, if you're always trying to get jobs for the home team in an aphoristic way, then your ability to grow as a financial center will always be limited. And I'll end here on a positive note, just to say that, as an alderman and former sheriff and potentially moving on to other things in the City of London, we are very open to partnering with everyone across the world. We're very happy to chat to people, very happy, as you've seen here, to give you quite a bit of free information and publish quite a bit of free information. And we see our job as very much helping everybody in the global economy to work better for better prosperity for all. I've often said that financial centers do compete without question. If I get some jobs that you could have had, I've got your jobs. That's not it. But actually, all financial centers are in it together, in that finance is only one way of solving society's problems. And we need to prove to society that we are doing so responsibly. And so it's also up to us to keep our markets clean and to make sure that our customers get a fair deal when they come into our markets. And we should be doing most of that without regulation rather than ranting about regulators. But we should be moving much more into voluntary standards and governance in that respect, which is done in so many other markets. But we seem, in my lifetime over the last 35, 40 years, to have moved more towards a kind of a star system where the regulator sits at the core of everything, when that was not the way that it was in the early days. But that's for another story about governance. So thank you very much. And now over to the panel and questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Mainelli. So I know that we're a little bit over time. I'm grateful if you would stay with us for another 15 minutes. I want to hand over to John Outridge now. John is the CEO for the International Financial Center in Trinidad and Tobago. He will serve as the moderator for this part of our session. We have Brendan King, who is a director of CCGI, and Marlon Yarde, also a director, and he's also at the moment CEO of the Barbados Stock Exchange. And they will engage you in this part of the panel discussion. John, can I hand over to you now? Professor Mainelli, if you can take off the slides now too, that would be great. Thank you. Yes, John, you can go on.
Thank you, Kamala, and afternoon, everybody, and thanks, Professor Mainelli. Very interesting presentation. It's a shame that we didn't see more representation from the Caribbean, but I guess that gives us some room for growth, right? Before I engage with my fellow panelists, it was very interesting as you were presenting that it actually brought me back to our conversations I've been very recently with someone, and they sort of split the world into two buckets, where you have emerging markets and you have developed markets, and it was very interesting to see when we were looking at that index, you're seeing all of the what I call the flagship names, right? The New York and the London and so forth, and some interesting things. And it really ties back into, I guess, to the theme of this conference, right? The Great Wealth Transfer. And, so many things that I've been observing, and as part of that discussion, it's really over the past decade, the average GDP growth from emerging markets, has been about 3.5%. When you look at the developed markets, it actually has been half of that. However, when you look at overall market capitalization, developed markets are basically almost 7 times larger than emerging markets. That's roughly accounting for like 87% of global equity value, right? But the idea is that you're seeing a turn of the tide, and the way these things are trending. And, as I said, your index kind of spotted, because you saw, I believe in your last slide where Busan just kind of popped up as second under New York, right? It's almost like if you look at where did Busan come from? A country of 3.5 million people, right? And this might be a sort of global trend that we are seeing, right, in terms of where emerging markets, based on the larger size, the rate of growth, and then obviously, as you were mentioning, right, the whole acceleration adoption of technology, right, and fintech being a large part in that, right, which again, from the Trinidad and Tobago perspective, from IFCs, and I know one of the presenters from Cayman Island earlier on brought it up, and it's a very interesting point, from an IFC's perspective, what really is your value proposition, right? And as you were mentioning, sometimes you need to be good in a lot of things. It's difficult to specialize. And I know from the TNT perspective, we are looking to pivot towards fintech because we see that as a growth area. And I saw that actually in one of your presentations where there was a correlation between Asia and the growth of Asia and related to the growth of the fintech sector. So what I would like to do is, just to get from your perspective, Professor Mainelli, in terms of talking about that from emerging market context, right? Because a lot of us here on the call within the Caribbean region, we are looking out to these developing markets, but based on the theme of this conference, right, that shift is coming, and I know we have challenges, and I was almost lining it up as you were presenting, right? When you talked about the last slide and you have these enablers, the business environment, in the Caribbean, the ease of doing business is very disparate. We are at different levels. From a regulatory perspective, we have always been very generally conservative. And then from a reputation side, and I would say reputation more monetary perspective, the lack of large, credible investment opportunities, So I don't know if you want to give some context, at least from your, I know you would not be able to put all of that information on your slide deck, but if you could talk some points on the emerging market aspect and how to put it. The ones who may not have made the top 20.
Okay, super. Kamala, did you want to move on to the second panelist first?
Yes, if it's okay, we can engage Brendan and Marlon and let them give their few minutes of response, and then we'll come back to you for your response. Is that okay, John?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Thank you, John. I'll pick up on those.
Yeah. Brendan, I don't know if you mind me going first.
No, sure.
The reason being, I had an appointment for 2:45.
Okay.
I thought I would be finished. I thought we'd be finished by 2:30, and there are some folks from Jamaica, so I have to head downstairs shortly.
Sure.
And I'll be very, very quick. And I do apologize. I really thought we would have been on, being able to make it on time. Well, I had an opportunity to go through Michael's presentation, and I, like everyone else, I thought it was a very interesting presentation. And there were certain points, that jumped out at me. And the main point that jumped out at me is that for you to really move up the rankings or do well on the rankings in in this CFI, in this index, in IFC's index ranking, you need to be competitive in all the areas. All areas you need to be competitive. You need to be competitive from a business environment perspective, human capital, infrastructure, financial sector, and reputation. And I was more looking from the perspective of the Barbados situation. We may be competitive in some areas. We may be competitive in some of the areas in the categories, but we need to improve in a lot of areas. And it goes back to the whole question of confidence and trust in the particular jurisdiction and what you're doing. Confidence and trust is essential. And I think from a financial center's perspective, how you manage your finances, and particularly how you manage how you manage debt is very important. People gain confidence and trust when they see you doing these things properly. I mean, we've had some issues in our market. Although we do well from a human capital perspective, we're a jurisdiction where the rule of law prevails. We have a good regulatory framework, etc. But the areas we need to do well in, and we would have noted in the case of Barbados, our rankings dropped by 26, dropped 26 by 26. And our rating points dropped by 48, and to me it has a lot to do, for example, and this is true for all the jurisdictions in the Caribbean area, how we manage our finances and how the impact, for example, of COVID-19 having on our financial situation, and also this whole question of climate change and how we manage that and how it affects us, particularly how, when we have bad weather and we have hurricanes, how these things affect our finances and our economies. In Barbados, we've had a number of incidents. For example, we had the volcanic ash impact on the island. We had a storm Elsa a few months ago, and these things impacted us. And we've noted in the case of Barbados, we would have been impacted by how we manage our debt. Our debt to GDP ratio was very high back in 2018. It was like 175%. Now it's 148. It dropped. Now it's inching back up because of these situations are outside of our control. So we need to find ways to be competitive in all the areas. And we need to show as a financial center that we are managing our finances correctly. But much is being done on our side to improve the situation, and I know that we will continue to improve. Barbados, out of the Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands, Barbados is third in the rankings in the Caribbean area, followed by Bermuda, Bahamas, and Trinidad and Tobago. So there is much that we can do as a group. And I think that we need to work together as a region, as opposed to trying to do these things on our own to really improve the situation for us here in the Caribbean. But again, I was very interested and this was very much new information for me, Professor Mainelli, and I really enjoyed it. And it's now forcing me to look at these rankings a bit more and try to understand even more how these things work. The other question to that chart, diagram where you showed us, this is a fear for everybody. Everybody just have to take the same exam. I always, when it comes to these measures that we have for rankings, I always like to understand what is the thinking behind it, and if the same standard that applies for a developed economy works for a small developing island. But if you want to play with the big boys, you have to meet the standards that the big boys put out there for you. Thank you.
Well, that was great, Marlon. Very interesting perspective from Barbados, and I really enjoyed the day. A lot of interesting discussions going on, and I think very pertinent to some of the goals that we have in the Caribbean. I have a tremendous connection to the region, former head of Scotiabank's operations throughout the Caribbean and Central America, and now I'm a senior advisor with Ernst & Young Caribbean, and board member of not only the CCGI, but also several corporates in the region. So remaining very well involved. And a couple of things really come out to me, and Marlon mentioned it around a regional perspective. The individual states in the Caribbean are small, obviously have population constraints, other constraints, but as an area, there's certainly things that can be done around improving the business environment that can lead to growth in the financial sector, growth in fintech, harmonization of regulations, of regulatory authority, of financial markets. Those are very important to seeing the Caribbean move forward and attracting investment and becoming more of a center for finance and fintech. There have been improvements, but there's still a ways to go to really realize the benefits of CARICOM. A lot of talk about it, a lot of movement has been taking place, and I hope that really continues. That's going to be a tremendous force for change and for good. The other area I think is very important is human capital, especially in the STEM area, science, technology, engineering, and maths. When Scotiabank put a new digital factory in the Dominican Republic, I led that charge and evaluated a number of centers in the Caribbean and Central America to put that in place. And the key thing that drove it for us was not taxes or incentives or real estate. It was human capital. Did they have the professionals that were needed to drive the fintech revolution that Scotiabank wanted to see in the Caribbean? And we were very satisfied the Dominican Republic had that, and therefore the center was built there, hired 50 or 60, very accomplished professionals, and we've seen a tremendous upgrade in the digital infrastructure of Scotiabank around the Caribbean. So those are two key things that I really wanted to emphasize: is try and look at the region from a regional perspective and see where it can be made easier to do business and to harmonize as much as possible to reduce the friction, cost, and time, and then continue to invest very strongly in human capital, especially in the STEM areas that can really provide the human resources that companies are going to need to build fintech areas, to build fintech businesses within the region. So with that, I'll leave it there. Thanks a lot.
Well, gosh, can I thank John, Marlon, and Brendan for those comments, which are very heartwarming, really, and very much in line with my thinking. I know we're a bit off schedule, so I'll just comment back and maybe help us get back on track. I'm starting with John, where you're looking at emerging markets. We have done a lot of analysis on what's the state of progression. Now, there is no ideal single road, but there are some broad statistical things, and I broke that down into our 5 basic areas. The first one is you have to have infrastructure. There's kind of no point talking about fintech and all if you don't have the internet working, and that of course includes power supplies and a lot of other basics there. It doesn't have to be fantastic infrastructure, but it has to be reliable infrastructure. Remember that financial markets hate volatility, that they can't make money out of. This is not good volatility. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, having got that infrastructure, what's next? Well, what's next is a good regulatory environment. Again, not great, but the biggest test of a good regulatory environment is openness and competition. In fact, one of the things we did most materially with Korea 20 years ago was to get them to realize that having single state monoliths was a really bad thing, because everybody didn't want to come in. The water wasn't fine. There was one big shark in there, and they didn't want to be the pansies who were going to be gobbled up. So you need to do that. And of course, state control, which I know in many small islands and nations is very, very tempting, is normally a good route to disaster. It indicates corruption. It indicates over-centralization. It indicates lack of opportunities. It indicates lack of vibrancy. It's just a really bad thing to do. So those are the kind of the first set of basics. Then I move extremely strongly into supporting Brendan. Then you just move, you got those in, now you move into education. It is about human capital, and it really is about STEM. And I'm not going to pick on things that I don't know the current situation, but I do recall 5-6 years ago trying to do some stuff in the Caribbean, and UWI was not accredited. It was self-accredited, I think. So it was just a complete saying, we don't really care how good we are. We're going to tell everybody we're good, even if we're not. And that sort of stuff really just doesn't fly. You know? And people see right through this. When they're making, we advise on location decisions all the time. And I got news for you, big companies aren't idiots. They pay people to think about it. And if they don't like it, they don't write an article about it. They don't write a letter to you asking you to change. They just don't come. It's very simple. I think there was another bit too, which was about a lot of these ratings. And there, Marlon, I do agree. Sometimes these ratings are big boys kind of coming down with their thing. Sometimes, though, they're good, and it varies. And I do sympathize, particularly with things like the way FATF works and the OECD. It is kind of, we will tell you how to work, even though we don't really know ourselves. And there is a lot of hypocrisy out there. And I think as you move up the ranks, some of the centers like Singapore seem to get a grip on how to manage that, but it's very tough there. And frankly, I sympathize. I do think when it comes to Barbados, one of the things I wish you would crow about more, which I think is fantastic, is the way you restructured what was a disaster into a bond that was able to be paid out if and only if you could afford to against. I mean, it was just superb stuff. You should be crowing that from the rooftops. Over here in the UK, I've been holding out Barbados as an example of an innovative way to handle state protection gap risk management. I mean, it was just super stuff and well done. So it's not like we don't see some of that as well. There's a lot of good stuff that goes on out there. And then two final points. One is I was out in Djibouti last month, near as darn it, surrounded by Somalia, Eritrea, Tigray, Ethiopia, Somaliland. It's an island too. They got 880,000 people there, and they've started to motor in the last 7 years since they got the Somali pirates under control. Absolutely amazing stuff. However, a lot of Chinese investment shot up to about 70% of their infrastructure investment is Chinese, and they're not fools. They can see what's going on. But I had to say bluntly to the economics minister that ultimately the problem in the West is that we're lazy. The Chinese were coming in and saying, you need a port, we'll build you a port, we'll find the funding for it. You need a railway connector, we'll do that, we'll find the funding for it. You need free trade zone and all this, and they were doing it all. Well, funny enough, what the Chinese are doing is what we in the West claimed was, public-private partnerships. We'd come in, fund the money and all that. So they're actually only doing what we said we would do. Unfortunately, these days in the West, everybody wants something wrapped up with a ribbon on it. And kind of, here it is, and it's going to go out to tender. Of course, don't worry, there won't be a real tender. You'll get it. That's what they all want. They've become very, very lazy. And I think you'll find, I'm thinking of Antigua, for example, if you want to move out of that kind of Chinese thing, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with what the Chinese have done. They've done exactly what a client wants. But I think you do need to move more to a kind of a bulletin board system. And that, I think, leads me to the point that Marlon raised, or John, about working together. And the truth is, the Caribbean shares a brand. Whether you like it or not, you share a brand. You compete too, but that's the case in so many other sectors. And I sit on the board of the United Kingdom Accreditation Service. We're the ones who handle all of the kite marks and brand marks for everything that happens in the United Kingdom. 3,500 labs, 800 certification agencies, all the toys, all the fire extinguishers. We've got various marks on it. We're the people responsible for regulating that. I often think people in financial services should learn a lot from the real economy about how this works, because it's done as a regulator. We are the regulators with 250 people for the 94% of the economy that isn't financial services. And if you know the UK, you got to ask what the others are doing all day in financial services. Now, that mark indicates exactly what I drove at. Those are shared brands. And the Caribbean has a shared brand. So yeah, if the Bahamas has a scandal, most people that I work with don't do indices the way I do and know the difference between the centers. It's, oh, the Caribbean is full of scandal. that doesn't help. So you've got to police things jointly, and you need to compete as well. Yeah, and so having, going back to this theme of working together, actually having a couple of bulletin boards with some ribbons on it that says, it doesn't matter if you come to the Caribbean, you're helping, here's our stuff. If it means that you go over next door and invest, well, we went next door and invest. That's still a benefit, still bringing plane flights. Plane flights lead to more traffic leads to more opportunities. And I'm afraid I'm a little long in the tooth. You know, I've always been an optimist about Africa, and I've always been an optimist for 45 years about the Caribbean. But it is a sad truth that the efforts to work together never really seem to come off. And I would encourage you, you know, really have yet another go. It's going to, one of these goes will work, but let's get moving again. And I think the Caribbean's got a lot of potential if it did work together, certainly much better potential than working apart.
Thanks a lot for that perspective, Professor Mainelli. I think that was a good way to kind of end our panel, because I know we're close to the time. I think we just have about 2 minutes. I don't know if anybody else, members of the webinar, have any questions for Professor Mainelli. If you want to throw it into the chat. I think it definitely was an exceptional presentation and some discourse.
Yeah, and
yes, I have one question. Just Michael, with regards to Dubai and the situation in the Middle East, what your thoughts are on Abu Dhabi, Dubai. Of course, Dubai, as you know, they suffered quite greatly in 2008, but then sort of rebounded to a certain degree. They've got the Expo 2020. And of course, when the lockdowns were on, there was that period when they were open and attracted a lot of social influences. Again, was some of that being factored into your studies? And what do you think of the futures of Dubai from a cultural and lifestyle and influencer perspective, and how that would reflect into their economy and finances, etc.?
Well, Peter, I could squeeze some comments into 2 minutes. It may not be a considered response. And as I warned you earlier, I'm not big on hot centers. And don't ask me what I'm doing in Djibouti in 44 degrees. But so there's a lifestyle thing there. I think one of the interesting things about Dubai and Abu Dhabi is oddly the biggest regulatory change in both of those. And in fact, interesting, a change that's going on in Djibouti at the moment and has gone on in Rwanda was the move to common law. This is not really seen by many people as the mega step it was to make those there. And people are opting in to the common law system for disputes and things like that. Now, from a Caribbean perspective, you already started with that advantage. But for them, that was probably the single biggest move in opening them up. I think when you move on from there, it's very clear that Abu Dhabi is taking a slow and steady and measured approach. Mind you, it's got the resources to see it through, and it's been moving what I might call into the heavyweight finance. And Dubai, which has got a huge dependence on property and therefore a lot of fluctuation and a very thin capital base, has been moving into trading and broking, which of course suits it. It was its sort of historic role more than Abu Dhabi ever was a trading and broking center around Dubai port and the first airline and all of that. So I think the two of them are developing in very different ways there. What happens beyond that in the region? Well, the region, you know, one could throw Qatar into this as well. Riyadh keeps telling us it's moving and makes moves in that direction. Ultimately, Saudi Arabia is the big preponderant population problem there, but whether that means that it moves into becoming a proper center or not, it's hard to say. I'd be a little pessimistic, certainly in the shorter, medium term. In the long term, anything can happen. So I hope that kind of gives you a bit of a flavor. But, you know, Dubai for the trading, Abu Dhabi for the heavy finance. And in both cases, it's their move effectively towards Western norms, which has allowed them to bring in things like arbitration, mediation, expert determination as services alongside the traditional finance that people tend to overly focus on payments and assets under management. It's the wider area that's more fascinating. It's that rich ecosystem of London and New York, Singapore and Hong Kong as well. They're all very rich ecosystems. Well, in fact, I'll just end on a little fact, which people don't get sometimes, is we're often told the City of London is a financial center. Well, of course it is. Of course it is. But in a pre-COVID normal day, 525,000 people work in the City of London. 188,000 work in banking and insurance. So that's less than 2/5. Of that 2/5, half of them are really in IT. So 1/5 of the people in the City of London work in banking and insurance. 118,000 work in science and technology. 55,000 work purely in ICT. And I just said another 90,000 in ICT work in it, but they're inside banking and insurers. The City of London is a technology and science center far more than it is a financial center. It's that rich ecosystem. And the examples I give are things like scientists who are hired on an arbitration case to look at the way in which they model the dispersion of oil in foam after an accident has happened to attribute liability. You see, so you've got thousands of hours going into the science and technology, and people say, oh, yes, 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 but it's really all about finance. Well, it is, but it's a much, much richer ecosystem than people give it credit for. Back to STEM arguments, Brendan.
Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Kamala. Very kind of you.